Greetings, I'm Hal Meng. I teach yoga here at the Defiance Ruston Senior Center, but I also am involved with an organization called Center for Food Preservation Arts. And the center's goal is to bring the traditions of home canning and food preserving back in as activities for everyone. We have classes, we do canning parties where people can make things for themselves and their families, but also one of our activities is one that we call Preservin' for the Hungry, where we are permitted to make applesauce and jams that can be given out through the pantry here at the Ruston Center, but also through any food bank or feeding ministry. And so today I was going to demonstrate how we make jam for the Preservin' for the Hungry. One of the advantages we have is we have a freezer space, and we get an awful lot of fruit donated that we prepare and then freeze. So we're able to make jams and jellies all year round. So these are some beautiful strawberries that part of them were donated from Storino's Farms last summer, and part of them came from a Costco bag. So usually when we're doing this, we do it in batches of 16 cups of berries, but today we're just going to do a half batch. So these have been defrosting for about 24 hours, and hopefully they're completely defrosted, because it works a lot better that way. Okay, just getting those started. And then in the recipe, we add some lemon juice to increase the acidity, which makes it safer when it's canned. But also I'm going to go ahead and add it in now before I finish pureeing it, because I want to help preserve the color, that nice bright red color. So in a full batch, we'd be using a cup of lemon juice, and it is always recommended that you use a commercially produced lemon juice, because lemons that you squeeze or lime juice vary in acidity all over the map. This then is standardized. Now we don't want to over puree it, because if you're familiar with canning, especially with fruit, you may have heard about fruit float, where when it completely sets up, you'll have a lot of the fruit floating to the top. That's because of the oxygen, the air that's stored in the fruit. So we don't want to over whip it, but only enough to get it well pureed. And then what we're going to be making this with is something called Pomonas Pectin. The thing that's different about Pomonas Pectin is regular pectins, all pectin needs what's called an activator. It's a thing that it works with it, and it creates these molecule webs that bind the water, and that's what makes things gel. Regular pectin, that's usually made out of apple peels, is activated by sugar. And often you need an equal weight of sugar to the amount of fruit you have to get it to set up. Pomonas Pectin, when you get it, it comes with 2 packages. One of them, the larger one, has the pectin itself, and then the second one has the calcium salt. And the pectin just looks like this, just a beige powder. I buy it at the beginning of the year in 2-pound lots because of all the work we're doing. And then the calcium powder is just a white powder. And to prepare the calcium powder, you mix a ½ teaspoon of the calcium with a ½ cup of water. And it will store in the refrigerator for years. Same thing with the pectin. As long as they're both well sealed, they keep for years. So since we're making a half batch, of our large size, we use 1 tablespoon of that. And then the pectin we deal with by mixing it into the sugar. Now this is a little less than 1.5 cups of sugar, and regular strawberry jam will often have 5 or 6 cups of sugar in it for the same proportional quantities. But if any of you have worked with cornstarch, you know if you take the cornstarch and just throw it into water, it clots up. That's the same kind of action that pectin does when it's activated. So the saying goes with Pomonas Pectin, it's liquid to liquids and pectin to sweetener. Because if you mix it with the pectin first really well, it keeps the molecules separated so it doesn't clot up into balls. And then we set this aside because all of this gets to be well cooked before we add this. So I'll go ahead. And then we're going to put it onto the heat and bring it up to a boil. All right, while that's coming up to a boil, I want to talk a little bit about how we can. Many of you may be familiar with this, but when it's up to a boiling temperature, pretty much all the bacteria and even botulism spores are killed or their growth is really retarded. So that you want to get it into a container where it's sealed at that temperature. And one way that we do that is we fill it while it's still, the mixture's still hot. We get it into the jars, and it comes with 2 parts for the lids. One is this metal disc that has a rubber seal on it, and the other is the ring. We fill to what's called the headroom. And the headroom is the amount of space, amount of air that you leave in there, because as it heats, that air is expelled. And that's what creates the vacuum. That's what seals the lid on. So you want to use a recipe that tells you the exact headroom and also how long it has to be at a rolling boil for the air to be expelled, but also that it's guaranteed that it's heated all the way to the center and maintained there. Once the vacuum is formed, see, we can do what's called truing. I'm just holding this by the lid itself. And for long-term storage, if we weren't handing this out, it's better to take the rings off and store them without the rings on, because if there's any moisture trapped, that gives it an opportunity for the moisture to come out. Also, heaven forbid, but if the seal is not good, and over time it starts to get a bacteria in there and ferments, often you can't necessarily see that. But when you go and you take the ring off, if you're holding it on with the ring, is a possibility. And so we're going to be running the jars we're going to be using through the dishwasher just before we are going to fill them so that they're warm. And then the lids themselves need to be warmed just so the rubber is loosened. In the old days, books and instructions would say to boil the rings. But with the new reformulated rubber on these, if you boil the rings, it actually weakens the rubber. All you want to do is get them good and hot by putting them in the water bath canner in a rack like this, or using a little magnet that comes with the canning kits often to get them up to temperature. That's what it will sound like when it seals. This has come up to a full boil. We don't want to boil it too hard because we don't want it to get really frothy and capture a lot of air. But once it's up to a boil, we take the prepared pectin and sugar and this is the point at which we add it in. And after that is well dissolved, we do something that's called a sheeting test. You can see how that it's making a coat there. And if I had remembered to put a plate in the freezer and then got it out, because that just speeds up the process. But you can see that we have a good proportion of the pectin to everything else in there because it's already setting up into a nice gel. So we have sterilized and washed really well the jars in the dishwasher, and then we've softened the lids. And the headroom is going to be approximately 1/4 inch. And just through time and experience, I've learned it's about between a couple of these lines that's on the threads for screwing it in. One of the really vital things is a canning funnel. I have seen people who have done this so much that they're very quick and they almost very precise, don't spill much. This also happens. One of these was given to me a gift years ago, and it was so incredibly expensive when I looked it up, but the price has come down to about $9. What's so cool about it, and it's called a canning ladle on Amazon and everywhere else, is you can pour from all three sides, plus it has that little hook. So over time, I've gotten used to being able to look down and see where it comes inside of the funnel and use that as my guide so I don't have to constantly be lifting that up and looking. And we're just going to get 3 of these done. And then I'll show you the other steps before I go on to fill the rest of them. So once you've got the jars filled, you want to make sure that there is nothing going to come between the rubber and the glass. And so paper towels that are slightly moist are the best thing to have available. And if you've been careful and used your funnel well, then you shouldn't need to do a lot of wiping except for the top. And then you do it finger tight. That is to the point where if you're just holding it with your fingertips, you can't hold it anymore. Because if you really scrunch it down, the lid has to be able to lift enough to let the air out. And that's a very small amount, but still, you need to be able to do that. And what we would usually do in one of the canning events is we'd have about 3 people doing this process. One would be filling, one would be wiping, one would be lidding and ringing, and then the other person would be putting them in the canners. We often do, the 16 jars per batch, but we've often do like 70 or even up to 90 jars in a session. So especially, we have a couple of induction burners that we set up here. So we can do 13 jars in each kettle. And then we can have 2 more kettles on the stove here. At Trinity Lutheran Church in Parkland, at St. Leo's Food Connection, here in Tacoma, they have 8 burners on their stove, and so we can really get cranking there. Because the one thing you want to do with jam is make sure you don't dawdle. Because if it sets up before you get it into the jars, that's kind of a mess. And you can reheat it, but sometimes if you reheat it to reliquefy it, it will break down the fibers of the pectin and it won't gel anyway. So we've gotten all the jars filled now. And got them all lidded and ready to go. And I always do a few extra lids and jars just in case, because water content of the berries can affect how much you get. So now, this is the other really vital tool. It's a jar lifter. And this allows you to set it into the nearly boiling water without burning yourself. So I'm going to take these over and put them in the water bath canner. And we've been working on here, I almost forgot to mention, the one thing you never want to do with these jars when they get hot is put them on anything that's metal or marble top, because it'll cause what's called a thermal shock. And if you've ever seen jars where the bottom is broken off in a line, that's usually thermal shock, because the bottom cools faster than the part above it. And if there's a stress line, it moves away from it. And it's actually a glass cutting technique, I think, in Spain and Italy. In the canners, there's water. And you want to make sure that when the jars are in there, the water covers about an inch above the top of the jar. And every recipe has a specific time that you want them in the water bath canner. And that time starts from when it's at a rolling boil. So it'll be a little while. So some of you may be interested in making a berry jam, and the berry recipe is pretty much the same with the Pomonas Pectin, but you can substitute honey, you can substitute xylitol or other sweeteners or agave. And the thing that's really nice when you buy a package of this is it comes with this instruction flyer, which isn't really a set of recipes, but it's a way of adapting any recipe to be using Pomonas Pectin. So there's directions for making them out of juice concentrate, jams and jellies, freezer jam, regular jams. But there is a book that's called Preserving with Pomonas Pectin that you can order. And they also have a jam hotline that you can call and get some information from. And so here is our product. 9 jars out of the batch. They need to sit 12 to 24 hours before they're moved a lot, because you want the rubber to cool completely and for it to seal. And other than that, then it's ready to go. If this was and this will be going to the pantry here, but in other cases, other places that we make them, we will take quantities of them into all the smaller food banks and pantries that need additional things like jams and applesauce. So thank you for joining, and I hope you'll be interested when the shelter place is over to look into doing some volunteering with us. They're going to be putting our website and our Facebook page information at the end here. So stay safe and stay sane.